Okay, so imagine this. You're right there, right at the heart of creating a whole new country, shaping its future, making huge sacrifices, personal ones, professional, political, you name it. But then, centuries later, you kind of get overshadowed. Like you were absolutely essential, completely crucial, but maybe not the first name people think of. Can someone be that vital to history, like fundamentally vital, but still kind of miss out on the big spotlight?
Yeah, that's a really fascinating question, isn't it? And maybe a little uncomfortable. It makes you think about how history actually picks its heroes.
Yeah.
We tend to go for the charismatic ones,
Yeah.
or the ones whose stories are easy to tell, easy to simplify. But sometimes, the really foundational work, the stuff that actually lasts, it comes from people who are deeply principled, incredibly smart, but maybe not the most flashy.
Exactly. Not the most obviously charismatic.
Right. They're the ones doing the hard yards, the stubborn, persistent work, often thankless work, honestly. Building things brick by painstaking brick.
Totally. And that description, it fits the person we're diving into today perfectly.
Yeah.
We're going deep into the life of a really pivotal, but often misunderstood American founding father, John Adams. And we're going to be looking at his story through this amazing book, David McCullough's Pulitzer Prize winner, John Adams.
That's a fantastic book, truly.
Isn't it? So our mission today is basically to peel back the layers of this incredible book, get into the details, the man himself, his principles, which were pretty unshakable, the massive challenges he faced, and his impact, his really profound impact on the U.S., which, like we said, often gets underestimated. Think of this like we're just chatting, maybe over coffee, exploring what makes this book so good and why Adams is just indispensable. You really can't tell this story without him. You might have these little snapshots of him from school. But honestly, this deep dive, I think it's going to show some surprising sides, some really deep insights into a guy who definitely deserves a much closer look.
I completely agree. McCullough's book, it's just a masterclass in telling history. It doesn't just list facts. It really pulls Adams out from behind, the more famous figures like Washington or Jefferson. It puts him right where he belongs, at the absolute intellectual and political center of that whole revolutionary time and the really difficult birth of the American Republic. So we're not just going through dates and events here. We're looking at the character, the convictions that drove everything. And McCullough does that so well, especially using Adams's own writings, his letters, which are just incredible.
Yeah, the letters are amazing. It feels like a real journey into his mind. Okay, so let's start unpacking this. Let's go right back to the beginning. The man behind the monument, his early years, the character that got forged back then. He was born, 1735, in Braintree, Massachusetts. And McCullough makes a point of saying his family was, modest, God-fearing.
Right. Not landed gentry, not like some of the other founders.
Exactly. And I think that's actually really important. It shaped his whole perspective, didn't it? He was, fundamentally a son of rural New England, steeped in those Puritan values, duty, discipline, hard work.
That background, that humble start, combined with the whole Puritan work ethic, self-reliance, working hard, being moral, thinking things through it, really baked into him this incredibly strong sense of duty, almost unwavering. And this deep belief in virtue, both personal and, for the community. You see it right from the start. McCullough walks us through his education, starting at Harvard. And what's really interesting is he first thought about becoming a minister.
Right. Which was a pretty standard path back then for a smart young guy, wasn't it? Very respected. Shows how serious he was, morally and intellectually, even then.
Definitely reflects that upbringing, but then he shifts. He finds his real calling in law.
And you can kind of see how that move from potentially the pulpit to the courtroom just sets the whole stage. It tells you he wasn't just about abstract ideas. He wanted to grapple with justice, with order, with defending rights in the real world. He was looking for a way his brain and his strong moral compass could make a direct impact, And law seemed like the way to do that.
Precisely. And this is where McCullough is just brilliant. He shows how those early beliefs, they shaped every single decision Adams made later on, in public life, in private life, everything. The key things that pop up early are this incredibly sharp mind, always questioning, a really strong moral compass, and just deeply principled, maybe even stubborn about it. Sure, he could speak well, he was articulate, but it wasn't just fancy words. It came from what he truly believed. Hard work, doing your duty, and always striving for virtue. Personal virtue, civic virtue. These weren't just nice ideas for him. They were the absolute foundation. He thought they were essential, not just for yourself, but for any society to function, especially a new republic trying to govern itself. Liberty and virtue, for Adams, were like two sides of the same coin.
And you see that principle tested almost immediately in his law career. He gets known pretty quickly in Boston, but there's one specific case that really shows his commitment to justice, even when it was super unpopular. I mean, defending the British soldiers after the Boston Massacre in 1770. Think about that.
Yeah, just pause on that for a second.
Rick, the tension was incredibly high. Adams is a patriot, he's on the American side, but he takes the job of defending the soldiers who fired on Bostonians. Killed 5 people. That was, wow. A radical move, really unpopular. It could have wrecked his career, put him in danger.
And what's so compelling there, what McCullough really drills down on, is how that single act shows Adams's absolute commitment to the rule of law. Even when it went against the grain, against popular feeling, even against the patriot cause in that moment. It wasn't about politics for him then. It was this deep conviction that everyone, no matter what they did, deserved a fair trial. Due process. He understood, maybe better than most, that a just society, the kind they were hoping to build, had to stick to those principles, no matter how tough or how emotional it got. Justice over popularity. That becomes his thing again and again. He wasn't scared to stand alone if he thought he was right. His argument in court, based on facts. Facts are stubborn things, right? That was his line.
Yeah, great line. And it wasn't just the Massacre trial. McCullough also covers his really vocal opposition to the Stamp Act back in 1765. Another early, clear sign of his patriotism, his political conscience waking up, his writings then, like the dissertation on the canon and feudal law, they showed this amazing clarity, this real passion for liberty. It marked him out as a serious voice against British overreach. He wasn't necessarily a firebrand, like some others. His arguments were always really thought out, legally grounded, but powerful, based on fundamental rights.
Exactly. He was building his influence not on charm or shouting, but on solid thinking, that hardcore sense of justice and knowing his constitutional stuff inside out. That early work showing that moral courage, it just laid the groundwork for everything else. It showed people he was a man of substance, not just talk. And that character, that bedrock, was going to be absolutely essential later on.
And speaking of bedrock, we absolutely have to talk about the partnership that really defined his personal life and honestly probably made his public life possible, his relationship with Abigail Smith Adams. McCullough calls their marriage, they got married in 1764, one of the great love stories of American history. And the reason we know so much, the reason it feels so real, is this unbelievable collection of their letters.
Oh, the correspondence is just phenomenal.
Isn't it? Like over 1,200 letters back and forth over 50-something years, and they're not just polite notes. They give you this incredibly deep personal look into their love, their devotion, but also the crazy, scary times they were living through, building a nation.
It's truly amazing. There's a sheer number of letters, sure, but it's the depth, the honesty in them. McCullough uses them so effectively to show Abigail wasn't just, the supportive wife in the background. She was absolutely his closest confidant, his intellectual equal, his moral equal, an indispensable advisor. Her brain, her insights into people, politics, even just running the farm back home, it sustained him, especially when he was gone for years at a time.
Yeah, she was holding down the fort, wasn't she? Raising the kids, managing everything, and giving him the political scoop from back home while he's off in Europe.
Totally. And through those letters, McCullough paints this really complex picture of John Adams, the devoted husband, the loving dad who was often absent, the philosopher trying to balance these huge public demands with his personal life. You feel the longing, the stress, the anxiety of this guy far from home, worried sick about his family, worried about this fragile new country. So that partnership, what does it really tell us about the kind of hidden strengths that maybe propped up these leaders?
And flip it around, how different could his public life, his ability to keep going, have been without her? Without that rock-solid support and intellectual connection.
Oh, it tells us so much. For John Adams, it seems like his personal foundation was completely tied to his public strength, his endurance. Abigail wasn't just comfort. She wasn't just running the household. She was a real intellectual partner. She challenged him. She refined his thinking. She was that steady emotional and intellectual anchor. Without her feeding him that support, that back and forth, it's hard to imagine he could have withstood the pressures he faced. I mean, it's almost certain he would have buckled at some point. Her insights, political, social, just about human nature, they were sharp. And she wasn't afraid to share them. Often they lined up with his thinking or maybe clarified it or even pushed him a bit. For you listening, it's a really powerful reminder, isn't it? How having that strong personal base built on real equality, real respect, intellectual connection, how that can make all the difference in public life, especially in crazy times. It makes him human. Even this giant figure needed that deep connection.
Yeah, it definitely humanizes him. And that connection, that partnership built on principle and smarts, it must have fueled his revolutionary work too. By the 1770s, as the book lays out so well, Adams is really stepping up, becoming a key figure in the resistance. He wasn't just talking, he was writing these powerful essays like that dissertation on the canon and feudal law we mentioned, showing real intellectual firepower and this burning desire for liberty. That essay specifically, arguing against tyranny in religion and government using history, it showed how deeply he understood rights and the dangers of power getting out of control.
He was, and McCullough really brings this out, a man of deep ideas. He'd read everything: political philosophy, history, law. And he believed passionately that these ideas had to be spoken, written about, defended, fought for. His time as a delegate to the First Continental Congress in 1774 really solidified his role. The book points out how crucial he was in pushing for unity between the colonies. That was huge because they were all so different, so many rivalries. He also, importantly, warned against just jumping into violence. He always believed in working through law, through reason, through strategy, even while pushing for this radical break.
Yeah, his focus on unity and reasoned argument, even as things were heating up, really stood out in the Continental Congress. He just became this relentless advocate for independence, not through shouting necessarily, but through solid logic, principled arguments, and just this fierce loyalty to the idea of liberty, but liberty based on virtue and law. And it wasn't just talking, he made some incredibly key strategic moves.
Absolutely. One of the biggest, and McCullough really spotlights this as showing Adams his unique judgment, was nominating George Washington to lead the Continental Army. And think about it, Washington wasn't chosen because he was some proven military genius at that point. He kind of wasn't.
Right.
Adams picked him for his character, his integrity, his discipline, his steady presence. Adams just sensed that this risky new venture needed a leader with massive moral authority, someone who could unify people, not just win battles. That says a lot about Adams' own insight, his ability to see the bigger picture.
Totally. And then, of course, his role in actually getting to independence and drafting the Declaration. We all know Jefferson wrote most of it, right? But McCullough makes it crystal clear. It was John Adams on the floor of Congress, arguing, persuading, pushing, that got it adopted.
He was the driving force.
Yeah. His moral philosophy, his legal mind, they shaped the whole debate, not just the final words. He was the one making the case, day after day, why independence wasn't just a good idea, but necessary, morally necessary.
Jefferson himself called him the Colossus of independence in Congress. That's how central he was to that debate.
Right. So, connecting that to the bigger picture, Adams wasn't just a politician or a lawyer playing the game. He was a really deep thinker. He understood the revolution wasn't just about splitting from Britain. It was about building something new, something lasting. A government based not just on power, but on virtue, on principles, on ordered liberty.
His vision of independence wasn't just political, it was moral. Liberty was this sacred thing worth sacrificing everything for, because it was about, the best of what humanity could be. That intellectual depth, that commitment to ideals, that's what really marks him out, even if it wasn't always the loudest contribution. He truly believed a republic needed virtuous citizens and leaders to survive.
And those sacrifices he believed in, they became incredibly real, painfully real during his long stretches as a diplomat overseas. The book really gets into the difficulties he faced in Europe. Starting with his first assignment to France in 1777, McCullough describes it as pretty much miserable for Adams.
Yeah, he did not enjoy the French court.
Not at all. He found all the ceremony and grandeur kind of suffocating, totally against his practical New England nature, and he famously did not get along with Benjamin Franklin, who was already there and loving it.
Right. McCullough lays out that contrast so well. Adams is blunt, serious, almost puritanical in his directness. Franklin is charming, loves the social game, knows how to work the room, maybe a bit more roundabout in his diplomacy. Adams just wasn't built for that kind of subtle, maybe sometimes superficial court diplomacy. And those letters home during that time, McCullough uses them to show the huge emotional cost. You feel his homesickness, how much he missed Abigail and the kids. He's torn between this absolute sense of duty to his country and just wanting to be home. He always put duty first, but man, the separation hurt him.
It's really tough reading those parts, seeing that conflict. But even with all that struggle, his sheer persistence paid off diplomatically. McCullough really emphasizes Adams's crucial role in the Netherlands. He worked tirelessly there and managed to secure huge loans for the American cause, money they desperately needed to keep the revolution going.
Absolutely vital funds.
And maybe even more important, he got the Dutch to formally recognize American independence. That was a massive win, the first European power to do so.
McCullough calls his perseverance there, often working against the odds, nothing short of heroic. Essential work, financially and diplomatically, when things look really grim for America.
And that determination, plus his sharp understanding of finance and international law, led to another huge success, being a key negotiator for the Treaty of Paris in 1783, the treaty that officially ended the war and got Britain to recognize the United States.
These diplomatic wins, even though they were grueling for him personally and often didn't get him much glory back home, were absolutely fundamental to America surviving. If Adams hadn't been so stubborn, so focused on getting the best terms, who knows how it might have turned out. He often pushed harder than even his fellow American diplomats wanted him to.
And then, after all that, he goes back to Europe again, this time to London, as the very first U.S. minister to Great Britain. I mean, can you just imagine the symbolism, representing the new republic in the capital of the empire they just beat?
It's incredible when you think about it, a true pioneer role, forging diplomatic relations from scratch. And those experiences, being in London, dealing with the monarchy firsthand, it definitely sharpened his thinking about different forms of government, about diplomacy, and about how fragile republicanism really was on the world stage.
But even with all these major accomplishments, securing loans, recognition, peace treaties representing the U.S. in London, the book keeps showing how Adams often felt. Well, misunderstood, underappreciated, constantly bumping up against other personalities and political games.
Yeah, that's a definite theme. It speaks to his character, right? Deeply principled, yes, but also blunt. Maybe a bit prickly sometimes. He didn't really suffer fools gladly. Integrity and directness came first. Social smoothness way behind.
So for you listening, just try to picture the immense pressure, representing this brand new, shaky nation to the old powers of Europe, especially for someone like Adams, who was so direct in an age that often valued subtlety and charm. It was a massive task for a guy who admitted he wasn't cut out for courtly games. Diplomacy was a duty for him, not a party. And that feeling of being sidelined or unappreciated, it definitely didn't end there. His next big role, vice president. Oh boy, he famously hated it. Elected the first VP under Washington in 1789. And his famous description, the most insignificant office ever invented. He just found it totally ceremonial, no real power. McCullough really captures his frustration at being stuck on the sidelines. Years presiding over the Senate, mostly just listening.
It's such a stark contrast, isn't it? After being right in the thick of things, debating, writing, negotiating treaties, suddenly he's presiding. He could break ties in the Senate, sure, but under a strong president like Washington, there wasn't much room for him to shape policy directly. He was used to being a mover and shaker. So yeah, this role felt like a cage for someone with his energy and intellect. He literally called it a place for a man to sit down in and do nothing.
Okay, so let's dig into that. How does someone that driven, that passionate about making a difference, cope with a job they genuinely think is meaningless? Why didn't he just quit? What does it tell you about his commitment?
I think it says everything about his sense of duty, that almost austere commitment to the republic they'd built. Even though he was personally miserable and frustrated, McCullough shows he didn't just check out. He kept writing, kept thinking deeply about government, about liberty, about human nature in this new context. He was also worried about the republic being fragile, worried about mob rule on one side, but also worried about too much executive power or aristocracy on the other. So those VP years, while maybe boring for him action-wise, were incredibly productive intellectually. He kept refining his ideas about how to balance things for a stable, virtuous republic. And he was watching closely as the political party started forming the Federalists, favoring strong central government, and the Democratic Republicans, more focused on states' rights and farming. He saw that divide growing right from his VP chair. His commitment to the American experiment itself went deeper than his feelings about any particular job. The Republic came first.
And that commitment, that sense of duty, got put to the ultimate test during his own presidency. Those turbulent years from 1797 to 1801. He wins the 96 election, just barely beating Jefferson, which kind of set the stage for the incredibly bitter politics that followed in this really divided country. He walks into a mess, especially with foreign policy that undeclared naval war with France, the Quasi-War.
Yeah, a super dangerous time for the U.S., just barely on its feet. And the pressure on Adams, especially from his own Federalist Party, was intense. To declare full war on France, France was seizing American ships, things were really tense. But McCullough really highlights Adams' decision to pursue peace instead. He was hugely unpopular then, went against the public mood, against many of his own advisors. But Adams genuinely believed going to war would be disastrous for the young nation. And his determination, his diplomatic efforts eventually worked. They reached a peaceful resolution, avoided a massive war, but politically, it cost him dearly, made him enemies within his own party.
That's such a key point from the book, isn't it? how he stuck to his guns, avoiding war, trying to keep the country together even when it made him unpopular, even when it was politically risky, even when maybe just declaring war would have been easier, politically speaking.
It really shows that character again, doesn't it? That deep sense of principle we talked about. It wasn't just talk, it guided him under extreme pressure. He put the long-term good of the nation ahead of winning the next election or being liked. But, and it's a big but, his presidency is also definitely marked by something really controversial, the Alien and Sedition Acts of 1798.
Right. Those are hard to ignore.
Very hard. Passed because people were scared of foreign influence, French spies, internal dissent.
Yeah.
These laws clamped down hard on free speech, especially the Sedition Act, which basically made it a crime to criticize the government. His opponents, the Democratic Republicans, saw them as totally authoritarian, an attempt to crush political opposition. And people were prosecuted under them, mostly newspaper editors critical of Adams.
And it's important, as McCullough points out, that Adams didn't actually write the laws, but he did sign them. McCullough suggests Adams was really struggling, trying to protect the country during what felt like a crisis, trying to avoid war, trying to avoid internal chaos, and maybe he later regretted how harsh they were on free speech. But still, signing them, that really damaged his reputation. People called him a tyrant, said he betrayed the revolution's ideals.
It's such a complex moment. He's navigating this new nation through incredibly dangerous international waters while dealing with intense fighting between parties at home, a deeply divided country. Signing those acts, it's still debated today. It really highlights that constant tension, doesn't it, between national security and basic freedoms, especially when people feel threatened, a tension we still wrestle with.
Absolutely, and all that political fighting, that division, that personal bitterness, it all came to a head in the election of 1800, which was just nasty, super personal, incredibly close. Adams loses to Jefferson, his old friend turned bitter rival, and McCullough describes how devastated Adams was. It was a huge personal blow, but, and this is crucial, he accepted the result. He ensured a peaceful transfer of power. The very first time in American history that power passed peacefully from one opposing party to another, that set an incredible precedent.
A monumental moment.
It really was. Now, he famously didn't go to Jefferson's inauguration, which people still talk about. But the key thing is, he didn't fight the result. He didn't try to hang on to power. He just went home, back to his farm, Peacefield, exhausted, feeling isolated politically, but absolutely convinced he'd done his duty. He'd kept the republic intact.
And for you listening, just think about how fragile things were then. A brand new democracy. No traditions for this kind of thing. The courage it took for Adams to step aside peacefully after such a brutal campaign, it's immense. His actions basically created the template for every peaceful transition since. It showed that the system, the Constitution, mattered more than any one person's ambition or hurt feelings. It was a true act of faith in the republic he'd helped build, even as it voted him out.
And that system, all those years of service and political fighting, it took a lot out of him. His retirement years, which McCullough describes so beautifully, show us the different Adams, more reflective. After decades away or in office, he goes back to Peacefield, his home in Massachusetts, and it becomes his sanctuary, a place for family, for reading, endless reading, for thinking, for writing letters, finally maybe a space to just be.
Yeah, this time lets him focus on family, especially mentoring his son, John Quincy Adams, who was brilliant and ambitious in his own right. McCullough explores that relationship complex, sometimes strained because of John's high expectations and John Quincy's own demanding career. But you also see how John Adams's core ideals, public service, intellectual rigor, virtue, deeply shaped his son. It's this poignant look at legacy, seeing a father's life work echoed in the next generation.
And imagine the pride, the sheer poetic justice, when John Adams actually lived long enough to see John Quincy elected president in 1824, the 6th U.S. president. Think about that. A founding father, one of the originals, seeing his own son reach the highest office in the nation they both served, that must have felt like validation.
It really brings that commitment to public service full circle through his own family, an amazing moment. But maybe the most touching part of the book, and honestly one of those amazing stories in American history, is McCullough's account of Adams and Jefferson becoming friends again.
Oh, that part is incredible.
Isn't it? After years of silence and bitterness, after that nasty 1800 election, they start writing to each other again in 1812. And it kicks off this remarkable correspondence, this intellectual reconciliation.
The letters themselves are just, wow, a total treasure. They talk about everything, deep philosophical stuff. Revolution, human nature, getting old, what history means, their own legacies.
It's like getting a private window into the minds of these two giants, looking back, figuring things out. With this amazing honesty and mutual respect, finally, It's like a masterclass in how to disagree profoundly but still connect as humans.
It really shows their shared love of ideas, their love for the country, and, yeah, a respect that somehow survived all the political battles. It's a powerful story about bridging divides, isn't it, given time and honesty?
McCullough also handles Abigail's death in 1818 really sensitively. It was clearly a huge blow to Adams. Her absence, you feel it in his letters afterwards. It just underscores how deep their bond was, and also amazingly shows his resilience even in that profound grief. He clearly carried her memory with him, always.
And then, the ending. The unbelievable timing of their deaths. July 4th, 1826, the 50th anniversary to the day of the Declaration of Independence. John Adams dies. He's 90 years old. And his last words, reportedly, Thomas Jefferson survives. Not knowing Jefferson had actually died just a few hours earlier that same day.
Right. I mean, here's where it gets almost mythical. Can you imagine the sheer poetry of that? These two titans, the guys who basically launched American independence, leaving the stage together on the 50th birthday of their greatest joint creation. It felt like, and McCullough captures this feeling, the closing of a chapter, like the founding era itself was ending with them. It's just unforgettable. It underlines how intertwined their lives and legacies really were. History has a flair for the dramatic sometimes.
It really does. Gives you chills just thinking about it. And it says so much about David McCullough's skill as a biographer. He didn't just read other books about Adams. He spent 6 years deep in it, reading Adams's own books, visiting the places he lived, the farm, the courts in Europe. His whole goal wasn't just to tell the story, but to show how Adams's character, his strengths, his flaws, his principles actually shaped the early United States.
Absolutely. His dedication to the primary sources, especially those thousands of Adams family letters, that's what gives the book its incredible richness, its intimacy, its historical weight. That deep dive is what makes McCullough's work stand out, and the critics, they loved it, called it a masterwork of storytelling, blending colorful narrative with sweeping insights. Praised as wonderfully stirring, extraordinary, superb, lucid and compelling, maybe the biggest praise, by far the best biography of Adams ever written. The book's success, commercially and critically, was huge. It undeniably put Adams back on the map, cemented him as this indispensable force in American history, finally pulled him out of the shadows for a mainstream audience.
Just incredible praise, well-deserved. But, no big book like this escapes all criticism.
Right.
And McCullough's John Adams, despite winning the Pulitzer, did get some critiques. Some people pointed out that maybe he didn't dig deep enough into Adams's actual political writings, his dense theories on government, things like his discourses on Davila. And some felt the commentary was maybe a bit too straightforward, like a really good summary rather than groundbreaking analysis.
And McCullough himself, which I think is really admirable, showed incredible humility about it all. In 2009, he publicly acknowledged he'd made a mistake in the book. He'd misattributed that Colossus of Independence quote about Adams. Jefferson didn't say it, Benjamin Rush did. And when called on it, McCullough just owned it. Said something like, "It's hard work. You're trying to get the truth about distant times. When you make mistakes, it's very painful, but you'll make mistakes. We're imperfect in an imperfect world."
Wow. That's really something. Coming from a historian that acclaimed, it kind of raises a bigger question for us, doesn't it? What does that tell us about doing history? About the integrity of a historian when they openly admit they got something wrong?
I think it tells us that history isn't some fixed story set in stone. It's always evolving. It's research, interpretation, and, constant correction. McCullough being candid like that. It shows the intellectual honesty, the humility you need in trying to figure out the past. It reminds us that even the best historians aren't perfect. And admitting mistakes doesn't weaken their work. I actually think it strengthens their credibility. Shows a commitment to getting it right, ultimately. It reminds us our understanding of the past is always a work in progress. Builds trust,
Yeah, that makes total sense. And despite those few criticisms, the book's impact, undeniable. Won the Pulitzer Prize for Biography in 2002, tons of other awards, and its popularity led straight to that fantastic HBO miniseries in 2008. With Paul Giamatti, who was amazing as Adams, that series brought Adams' story to millions more people.
Absolutely. The miniseries really cemented Adams' place back in the public eye, made sure this complicated, essential, often overlooked guy finally got the kind of widespread recognition he deserved. It was a huge achievement for McCullough, taking this dense history, this complex man, and making it so compelling, so human, for such a wide audience. He didn't just write a book. He really started a conversation about Adams again.
So, as we wrap up our deep dive into David McCullough's John Adams, let's just quickly recap the big themes that really jump out from this amazing book. Adams's principled leadership, even when it hurt him politically, the huge personal cost of that kind of unwavering public service, the power of his words, his ideas, and maybe above all, just the fundamental importance of character in leadership, especially when you're building something new. He was a man of incredible integrity, a relentless thinker, flawed for sure, but deeply principled, often overshadowed, yeah, but absolutely vital to the foundation of the U.S.
Right. This whole exploration of Adams, through McCullough's lens, it's more than just history. It's really a meditation on what leadership means, what sacrifices are needed to build something that lasts. It's a powerful reminder that greatness isn't always about charisma. Sometimes it's quiet, sometimes it's stubborn, sometimes it's intensely intellectual and deeply principled. It's in sticking to the rule of law when it's hard. It's in the patient work of diplomacy, of building institutions. So maybe the closing thought for you listening is this. What does Adams's story make you think about leadership today in our own complicated times? What qualities do you think are truly essential, even if they aren't the ones that get the most applause or the most clicks?